Is everybody ready? It is the appointed hour. My name is Jeff Homer. I'm from a company called Ensemble Performing Arts. And I'm going to tell you lots more about that, but I want to start in a more fun place, which is thinking about your entrepreneurial journey. So everyone in this room, if you're a studio owner, I want you to think back to the moment where you started your studio. And that can mean different things for different people. Maybe that was the moment where you filed your LLC paperwork with your state. Maybe it was the moment where you hired your first employee. Maybe it was when you signed your lease for your business. Maybe it was when you came up with the name. But I want you to think about where you were when you started your studio. And at that moment in time, I want you to imagine that every job function in your business is symbolized by a hat. And at that moment, you're wearing every single hat in your business. And one of your jobs as entrepreneur, as you're growing your business, is to hand off those hats to other people who can help you wear those hats and perform those functions and grow your business. So maybe you handed off the front desk administrative hat. Maybe you handed off many of your teaching hats to other people. Maybe you handed off your accounting and finance hats to other people. And over time, you work to elevate yourself within your business by handing off those hats and bringing in lots of really talented people who are going to be on your team. And that's sort of that create, grow, building into a leadership role where at some point you're working more on your business instead of in your business, as the saying goes. And I want you to imagine there's actually one more step than that. There's a moment where it comes time to hand off that CEO hat to somebody else. And in most other industries in the country, this is a moment that's really celebrated. We talk about exits as being really big wins for entrepreneurs who sell their company to Microsoft or Google, or who IPO their company. And so that transition is usually really celebrated. And it's only in the performing arts space that feels sort of like the end or a tragedy. And I want to really reframe that idea that creating something of lasting value is a really remarkable accomplishment for an entrepreneur. And if you can create a business sort of like a child that grows on to have an adolescence and an adulthood that can sustain itself without your involvement, that's a really remarkable achievement and something that we should celebrate and really work towards in our industry and try to lift up people who are ready to move on to the next phase of their career. So I want to start with the idea that selling is a natural part of the entrepreneur's journey, and it's a really positive thing if something that you've built can live on to serve your community both externally and within your studio for many years after you've ceased to be involved. So who are we? We are Ensemble Performing Arts. We are a partnership of 45 dance and music schools that we've built through acquisition. So we've done 45 school acquisitions. I'm not aware of anybody who's bought more schools than we have. So we're here sort of sharing our experience. I noticed folks taking photos of the slides. You're welcome to do that. You can also download the slides from the conference website. If you want an exact PDF copy of that, you can get that. There's also there's a QR code handout at the end of the slide. So whatever is best for you. So we've built our business through acquisition, but we've worked really, really hard to maintain the existing brand and identity of each of those schools that we've brought on. So there are no Ensemble Music School, Ensemble Dance School in a given market. We do business as Needham Dance and Music Academy, Tampa Music School. We try to retain that brand identity that was built by somebody who worked really hard, poured the blood, sweat, and tears into building that business and making that name recognizable within the community. And our job is to use national resources behind the scenes to really support that local identity and that local kind of boutique look and feel on the front end. That's part of our success model. So we use our national resources to support great outcomes across our school portfolio, and we want to be a partner of choice for entrepreneurs in the dance and music space when it comes time to move on to retirement, young family, relocation, other business interests. These are all sorts of common reasons why people end up in touch with us at a moment where they're looking for somebody to take care of this wonderful community that they've built and want to put it in a safe pair of hands so that it can continue to serve their community for the long run. So here's what we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about defining your legacy and sort of what you want to happen after you leave your dance school. We're going to talk about the sale process in a reasonable amount of detail so that you'll have a good understanding of what that will look like, whether that's something that you might be excited to do next year or 10 years from now. You'll be prepared to know sort of how that's going to happen and how to approach that. We'll talk about business valuation. So what is your studio worth? And what to do, sort of what levers to pull if you want to increase that value so that you can walk away with a greater nest egg for whatever you're doing after you walk away from your studio. And that's point number 4, is sort of what to do today if selling your business again, a year from now, 15 years from now, if that is sort of going to be the capstone of your entrepreneurial journey, how to best position yourself and what to work towards in the interim. So we'll talk about defining our legacy. So most folks that are considering a sale of their business have a couple of really fundamental questions, and they're natural, and they're just sort of evidence of the amount of care that we all have for our studios. Right? The first question is, what's going to happen to my community? That's almost first, right? It's not even what's going to happen to me, but what's going to happen to my community? Are my people going to be taken care of? Will my staff and my teachers be taken care of? What's going to happen to my students and parents? Is this going to be a good experience for them? Because I care about them, and I want to make sure that they're in good hands. What will be the financial reality of selling, right? So I know that my business has a qualitative value. I know that people who come into my building have a great experience and are growing as people and as performers, as dancers, as musicians, and I know that that has value. But what is the financial value of that, right? And how do I calculate what that is going to be worth in the marketplace in my community? And then what am I going to do, right? This has been something that I have lived and breathed for many years. What's my role going to be? Is there an option for me to stay on, to be a master teacher? Can I choreograph? Can I still run the studio, but just not do the boring payroll and finance and accounting tasks that I didn't like doing anyway? And sort of what is the relationship going to be between me and my studio and this new owner of it post-closing? And those are all questions that we'll get into over the course of this presentation. So this is what I would sort of characterize as the sale process. And we're going to step through these one by one slide for each step in the process. We're going to talk about what this looks like. So the first is obviously we need to decide if selling our business is actually something that's of interest to us. So this involves a lot of introspection. It's mostly about how do we want to spend our time, right? We have invested all of this time and effort in building this wonderful community, and it gets to a point where the question is, are there other things that I'd like to be doing with my career? Is this, do I want, is growing my family important? Is caring for my grandchildren something that's more important? Am I looking to relocate across the country? It's a really question about time and energy. And often this involves sort of discussions with family, with business mentors, with members of the community about how you're looking to spend your time. And ultimately, what we're looking for at this stage is just a commitment to explore our options, right? Are we serious about moving forward? Do we want to have conversations and learn more about what it would look like for someone to come in and assume ownership of this community that we've built? Next, we need to start the process of trying to find a buyer for the studio. So there's really two ways of going about this. First is sort of the network approach, and second is the hire a professional whose job it is to find a buyer for your studio. So in our business, it's really common to look sort of within our community for a potential acquirer of our studio because we're comfortable with there's someone we're likely to have a personal relationship with, someone we trust who understands the culture of our studio and who is going to first do no harm through that transition. So we often look at one of our teachers, one of our senior staff members, one of our parents maybe. Those are really common buyers for a performing arts studio. And additionally, there might be a competitor across town, someone that you respect and has done well and might have the financial capacity to buy your studio and that you think would do a good job of managing that. And Ensemble is really trying to be part of that conversation. We'd like to be one of those names that are sort of come to the top of your mind when you're thinking about who could potentially be a really safe and comfortable acquirer of your studio. If you don't have someone like that in your community, or if you just want to cast a wider net, the way that most folks end up accomplishing that is by retaining a business broker to market their business for them. So small business brokers are everywhere. They vary enormously in quality. It's really helpful to get a referral from someone in your community that may have sold a business and work with someone who they liked. But a business broker's job is ultimately to go out and market your business, position it in the best possible light, and bring you potential acquirers for you to say, I think that's a good fit, or I think that's not a good fit. And hopefully you get a reasonable selection of folks coming forward so that you can have a good selection as you think about who is not only going to put forth a good financial offer, but who you're going to feel comfortable, again, handing over that community to and being confident that the folks within that business are going to be taken care of. When you're working with a broker, typically the financial terms that they're going to charge about 10% of the sale price of the business. That's going to be their fee. And it's usually going to be success-based, meaning you don't pay anything until the business is actually sold. And the main exception to that is if they're doing meaningful work up front in terms of valuation or sort of advising you from a professional services perspective, they might charge you a small fee in advance, $5,000 to $10,000, something like that. And then again, the bulk of the fee to a broker, if you're using one, will be will be that 10% of the sale price. And again, that's one of the reasons why we'd love to be the first call, so that you don't end up paying the 10% when you ultimately then end up selling to us, because we are in touch with those brokers anyway. So that's why we'd love to be part of that kind of first phase. But when you find a buyer, someone that you've met with, who you feel comfortable with, you think they understand your studio, you think they see the vision, and you share kind of that comfort, and there's a reasonable alignment on sort of valuation, we're going to move to a phase called the letter of intent, or LOI. So you hear this term often. What this basically means is we're going to write down in plain English, instead of in lawyer speak, we're going to write down in plain English a reasonable business agreement with enough detail that we can hand it to the lawyers and say, make this official, right? Expand this into something that is actionable and that we can transact upon. So an LOI is going to have a couple of key pieces of information in it, right? It's going to specify a purchase price. We've agreed to sell the studio for $500,000, or $100,000 upfront plus a note of this much payable on these terms over time, or whatever the agreement is. It's going to be spelled out there. It's going to talk about, again, is this a cash offer, or am I getting payments over time? What is my timeline from today when we're signing this LOI to closing? That will be spelled out. We're going to try to close September 15th or October 31st, but we're going to agree on what date we're working towards. And importantly, by this point in the process, your buyer should know a lot about you and your business, and they should be able to tell you what they need to get from where they are today to closing. So they should say, hey, I want to learn more about your employee issue, the ERTC credit that you claimed and that is working its way through your P&L, and somewhat like this issue you're having with your landlord because the roof leaked, and whatever. There should be an identifiable number of due diligence items that the buyer can say, this is my checklist, basically. And so it's not really carte blanche for them to say, I'm going to kick the tires and I'm going to poke around some more and I'm going to waste your time. But sort of saying, hey, I know a lot about your business, and here's what I need to get comfortable with in order to feel comfortable transacting. We're going to spell out who's going to run the business post-closing. Is it you? Is it the buyer? Is it one of your staff members? What's our plan for operating post-closing? How are you going to be involved in that? What are you staying on for 2 weeks, 6 weeks, indefinitely? Sort of as a seller, what's your role in that transition, and what are the expectations? Is that paid, unpaid? How is that working in the transaction? And often there's going to be some kind of reference to a non-compete agreement, right? So as a buyer, same as all of you with your teachers, our worst fear is we buy the business from you, you open up next door, and all of a sudden all of your, everyone that knows you and loves you moves over to that new studio. And so there'll generally be some kind of non-compete for a fixed term and a fixed radius around the school, right? So unlimited non-competes are generally not enforceable, same as in employment contracts, but in the context of a business sale, you can generally get a reasonable non-compete, something like 3 to 5 years, and a reasonable radius, something like 10 to 25 miles around the existing studio that's being acquired. But there's going to be an LOI. It's going to spell out the transaction in a lot of detail, and both parties are going to sign and kind of hand it to their lawyers and say, this is our intention. Please make it into an enforceable legal contract. Then we're going to get into the due diligence phase. And I love to explain this as sort of the trust but verify phase. So up to this point, we've been mostly operating under the assumption that all the information we've received is true, and that is the basis for the valuation and the transaction that was put together. Now we're going to dig in and we're going to make sure that was the case. So we're going to spend some more time on the financials. Previously we took the financials as sort of a fact. Now we're going to dig in and go through the bank statements and make sure that we agree with those sorts of things. And then also remember that in the LOI we had our checklist, right? So there should have been sort of specifically identified items. Hey, we're going to want to go talk to the landlord and resolve this issue. We're going to want to make sure that we have a conversation with the proposed manager of the studio, make sure they're on board with this, and that they're going to be around post-closing. And we're going to sort of work through our punch list and work towards ultimately getting a full purchase agreement contracted and negotiated. So again, expanding that LOI into a 20 or 30 page legal document that we paid a bunch of money to create that reflects all of the process, and ultimately get to closing, right? Money in your bank account. And then sort of the question of what comes next, right? So we've closed the deal, we've made this announcement, and we wake up the next morning and there's a few $100,000 or millions of dollars in the bank account, And the question is sort of like what now, right? And there's a couple of important steps at this phase, right? So we like to talk about cultural onboarding and technical onboarding when you have a new buyer that's coming onto your school. Technical onboarding is easy and obvious, right? We need to change who's paying for the electricity. We need to change who's paying for the lease. We need to make sure that there's a new corporate card for the school that the manager has so that they can buy materials. We need to get payroll information. All of these sort of blocking and tackling items. They have to get done. But they're relatively straightforward, right? We just make a list. We chuck through them. The hard part is the cultural onboarding, right? How are we going to sell this transition to our community? And a lot of that depends on what's the post-operating plan. If you're going to be actively involved post-closing, maybe it's not difficult for people to imagine at all. If you are not today pre-sale actively involved in the business, maybe it's not a big deal. Maybe everyone can say, hey, I know and like that general manager or that artistic director. They're staying in place. I feel really comfortable. Maybe it's not challenging, but if it is, we need to make a plan for outreach to all of our key constituencies, right? So for our teaching staff, for our administrative staff, for our students, for our parents, we need to make sure that we point to what does this mean for you? And as much as possible, we want the answer to be, it's going to be the same. The studio that you know and love is going to be the same post-closing as it was pre-closing. And here's why you can trust that, right? Maybe the studio director is staying in their role. All the teaching staff is staying. We're not changing any class schedules. We're not changing the tuition or policies or any of those sorts of things. So we sort of make these commitments about continuity so that everyone can really feel secure through this transition. And then we ask for a little bit of trust and say, hey, I'm the seller of this business. I care deeply about it. I wouldn't be putting it in hands that I wasn't confident we're going to be able to execute post-closing. So give this some time. Let's see, trust us and kind of see how it unfolds. And that's sort of that cultural onboarding piece, that transition piece, where we work really hard to make sure that all of those constituencies feel secure. They have someone to point to and say, okay, I think this is going to be the same or better. And they're able to sort of trust and then experience day after day after day that, hey, this is going okay, and I feel secure, and rebuild that sense of community and security that's present in the school. So that's the sale process. Generally, from sort of we have a buyer to closing, you're looking at about 8 to 12 weeks. From decision to sell to buyer could be one day to many years, right? So it's sort of that. But the actual sale process from you're working with one or two parties on a serious basis shouldn't take more than about 2 to 3 months. If they're also serious and pursuing it in a professional and focused fashion. So that's the sale process. Now we'll get into what everyone really wants to know, which is what is my studio worth? So we'll talk about how to value a small business, right? So this isn't dance studio valuation. This is small business valuation. So all of the small businesses in our communities are transacted from time to time, right? So whether it's the gymnastics school next door, the restaurant down the street, all of the small businesses in our community are bought and sold from time to time, and we can look at those transactions as data points and sort of infer what the market valuation for a small business with wonderful community-driven aspects like ours might be. And the way that we typically end up conducting valuations, we try to calculate two different things. So we try to calculate the earnings power of the business. This is called seller's discretionary earnings, or SDE. And then we use a multiple of that number to arrive at our purchase price. And the magic to seller's discretionary earnings, or SDE, is right there in the word discretion. So it means all of the earning power of the business, no matter how you as the owner experience that, right? So sometimes as business owners, we want to pay ourselves in salary, we want to take distributions, we want to just have the business pay for our automobile, pay for our trip to Hawaii, pay for, so all of those are earning power of the business, irrespective of how we use that earning power. And that's the discretion part of SDE, right? So when we calculate this number, we need to think about all the value that the business accrues, and then sort of collect the big buckets of it, right? So if we pull out our tax return, we're looking at the net income figure. That's obviously profit. We're looking at what we paid to ourselves, which is benefit to us as the owner. We need to then think about what is the sort of fair value of the services I provided to the business, right? So what would it cost to replace me on an arm's length basis? So if I'm teaching, if I'm administering, what's it going to cost to replace my labor? And then deduct that. But usually we're paying ourselves significantly more than it would cost to hire somebody to do those sort of more day-to-day tasks. And then we're going to look at expenses that our accountant put on our P&L or put on our tax return that are not necessarily necessary to run the business. So meals, travel, automobile expense, subscriptions to professional development or things like that are really for you. They're not for the business. We add that all together. That's your SDE number. Then we're going to use a multiple. And this, if this feels squishy and like shorthand, it's because it is. I would love to tell you that it's 2.95 times the SDE, but that's not the reality of how this works. Using multiples is a way of sort of expressing a wide variety of qualitative factors and getting to sort of an approximate range for valuation, which is going to depend a lot on company size. So the size of your small business is by far the most important determiner of what SDE multiple range you're going to fall in. The reason for that is that as businesses get larger, the presumption is that they're going to be further on that kind of child to adolescent to adult scale of a business. The larger the business is, the more resources it's going to have to be able to take care of itself, right? Mark Zuckerberg needs no help from any of us to run Facebook, and so when we buy a share of Facebook, it's a purely passive investment, right? And small businesses exist somewhere on this part of the spectrum. Sometimes the owner is really, really involved and invested in running the business, and that's sort of like buying a job. And then, in the middle side of the spectrum, maybe there's, day-to-day coverage for the management of the studio, but we still get called in for emergencies or HR or personnel decisions, or we're running the finances sort of in the middle, or, maybe we are, really truly passive owners and, studios in Ohio, we're in Florida, my phone doesn't ring very often, whatever the case may be. But go ahead.
Sorry, can you just clarify when you talk about size? For us, does that mean like number of subscribers, basically? What do you mean when you say size? So any measure of size will do, but what I'm specifically talking about is revenue, right? So if you're well, SDE is actually probably they're all connected, right? More students, more revenue, more gross income, they're all connected. In this context, let's actually focus on SDE because it's the first bucket. So if you are doing less than about $500,000 of SDE, so not gross revenue, but if your earnings power of your business, take-home income, salaries, add-backs, all that kind of stuff is less than about $500,000, we usually see an SDE multiple range of about 2.5 to 3.5 times your SDE. As you get larger, maybe like 1 million plus, you see a wider range, and it's because you start to get into that, my business is more of a financial asset and less of a job sort of territory. Where you fall within that range is going to be determined by, again, size of the business, but also its growth trajectory. Is this a business that's shown evidence of, has a lot of historical growth and is likely to continue to grow in the future? Did we do this? Are we doing this? Or, have we shown a nice trajectory of growth? What is the quality of our revenue? Do we have things like rollover registration in place? Do we expect that the majority of students that are enrolled with us today are likely to continue with us in the future? And then lastly, are there strong human beings, like people, and then systems and processes in place to empower those human beings such that the business is actually a transferable asset as opposed to something that really involves us as owners. So that's how you're going to get to a small business valuation. We're going to calculate the earnings power of the business. We're going to calculate an SDE multiple. Again, we're going to use, most of us are going to fall into that 2.5 to 3.5 times range if we're doing less than about $500,000 of total take-home annual earnings. And as you get into the sort of $500,000, $1 million range, maybe you see progress up towards maybe like 3 to 5 times, and then above $1 million, the range widens dramatically because so many different types of businesses in that bucket. So that's valuation. The last thing I'm going to offer before we take a bunch of questions is just talking about what to do today. So if we want to take our business and maximize the opportunity to make our business as attractive as possible to a prospective acquirer, I have two suggestions for you. The first is, as much as possible, try to design your business to be able to run without your involvement, right? So we want to empower our folks in our business, and we want to create systems and processes where they can make repeatable, successful interventions in operating the business that don't require them to pick up the phone and consult you about how to do those things, right? So we want to, we want to have that front desk staff that feels empowered to make the call on, am I giving a refund in the situation? Am I, enforcing the policy? Am I making exception? Sort of, and then being able to get feedback on that decision without having to, again, pick up the phone and call you in real time. The beauty of this suggestion is it's actually a way to test out sort of removing yourself from the business gradually before you have to make the decision to sell and kind of cut yourself off cold turkey, right? You can take one step out of the studio and sort of feel what that's like. Do I miss the studio? Do I wish I was there? Or am I really delighted with what I'm spending my time on now? And it's sort of a way to build that capacity within your organization to test out, again, how you want to spend your time, how you want to allocate your energy. And at the same time you're doing that, you're making your business more transferable because there are fewer things that are really depending on you personally to be successful. The second thing is prioritizing financial hygiene, which means making sure that when you present your business to a third party and you have, at the moment where you have to put your books on the table, that they fairly represent your business and the wonderful, earnings power that it has, right? So if you, it's great if you, to yourself, are saying, hey, well, this Costco purchase I made and I brought home to my house, or this Amazon purchase that I made that I shipped to my house, that in the moment that seems like a win, right? We're getting tax deductions on personal expenses. That seems great, but that's the type of thing that's really hard to go back after the fact and say that wasn't a business expense to a third party, right? And it doesn't have to be a buyer of your business, right? Maybe this is a bank that you're trying to talk to, right? Maybe you want to build out a new space or expand your facility, or you just go through a difficult time and you're looking to present the business to a third party. Being able to prove or have some evidence for, what was a personal expense and what's a business expense is really important. So again, it's straightforward that the business doesn't need a car, right? So automobile expense is one of the things where it's like, hey, no problem. We can identify that. But if we're commingling, business and personal expenses, or doing our Costco run and sending some of the stuff to the store and sending some of the stuff to the home, travel or those sorts of things, it becomes a little bit muddied. And additionally, if we're running like multiple lines of business, right? So if you own your building and you're running your building expenses through your LLC, or God forbid you own a second business and you're running it through the LLC or the same bank account because it's, it was easier and it was convenient. We want to do as much as we can to separate those things so that when you go to present your business to someone, you're giving the best possible, presentation and communicating the value of it as clearly as possible in a quantitative fashion. So action items here are, get yourself an accountant, get yourself set up on QuickBooks Online. Make sure that QuickBooks account is for the dance studio itself and not for a mixed bag of things. Be thoughtful about what expenses you choose to run through your business and whether they are specifically identifiable after the fact, whether we can strip them out. Even if today it seems like a sort of free lunch, that's the sort of thing that can kind of come back to bite us in the future. So those are my thoughts. I'm going to take a bunch of questions, but first I want to offer two resources. So if anyone wants to have kind of a coffee chat here at Dance Teacher Web, I have a link to a Calendly up there. You can schedule a time to meet with me one-on-one. And then we have this PDF handout. Again, it's kind of a quick summary of everything we went through today. You can scan that QR code on the bottom and get that. But I would love to take your questions. I'm happy to help with sort of anywhere you are along that journey. Would love to talk more about it.
I hate taxes, so I expense everything I could possibly expense. But at what point, how far back are you looking? I don't feel like I'm ready to sell maybe today, but if I'm thinking I'm 5 years out, is it time to start taking on a more tax burden? Is it strategic to take on more tax burden, look more profitable?
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying?
Like, I know what you mean. And first I'm going to scan the room to make sure there's no IRS agents in here. Right?
Come to Dance Teacher Web.
Yeah, exactly. So the answer is generally we're going to look at like 3 to 4 years of history. And it's not necessarily the case that we're going to like take a strict average of that, right? So right now that 4 years would include COVID. Of course, we're not going to like penalize people for what happened then. We want to value the business based on where it is today at this moment and our sort of reasonable expectation of where it will be in the future. But we're going to look at some history for context in about 3 to 4 years is kind of the right answer. Again, there are ways of doing this type of thing in a more strategic way. Have a separate Amazon account for business and personal, right? It still shows up as Amazon, but you can at least, produce receipts. Where did this go? Where did this go? Again, just be thoughtful about what are those expenses and whether you could, credibly split them out after the fact, and just have some kind of system for being able to differentiate, and that will be a big step in the right direction.
So, not to brag or anything, I'm incredibly blessed. I own a building that's worth $1.5 million.
Nice.
Then you put the school on top of that. Can you sell the school and be the landowner? Can you do both?
Yeah.
Who can afford both?
Sure. So that's a great question, and I appreciate you bringing it up. I'm sure that many of you, encountered Sam Beckford at some period of time, and I think that was one of the gifts that he gave to this industry, right? Was really advocating for people to buy their building, and during a period of time where real estate prices increased dramatically, he created a lot of value for a lot of studio owners who now own a building that's worth a bunch, in addition to a studio that has a lot of value as well. So there's a couple solutions. So I will speak for ourselves. We don't buy real estate. But we often buy studios from folks who do own their real estate, and either we become their tenant, we send them a bunch of money every month, and they get to sort of replace some of that income from the studio with rent from us, or with a buyer, with an arm's length buyer in place, it's relatively easy to sell that real estate portion to a real estate investor. So once you have, an owner-occupied piece of real estate from the perspective of a real estate investor looks more risky because they're saying, hey, if you're going to occupy this, why are you selling me the building? Is there something wrong with it? Do you have kind of adverse plans for the business? Is the business healthy? There's sort of questions around that. Whereas if you've sold the business and it's sort of a true arm's-length third-party owner-operator, that piece of real estate just looks like any old, commercial real estate investment. And you'll be able to sell that, and there's a very liquid. It's much easier to sell the building than to sell the business. So generally, we buy the studio. We enter into a 5 or 10 year lease for the space, and then the owner of the studio sort of has the option of holding on to that cash flow and sort of using that, continuing to benefit from the appreciation of the real estate. Or if they're looking to exit entirely, it's relatively straightforward to sell that real estate once you have a third-party buyer that's in place and leasing from the studio. And the second question you asked is, one of the things I think really differentiates us is, if you have a studio that's worth $1 million, it's hard to imagine a teacher or maybe one of your parents, maybe not, but it's harder to imagine what individual is going to be able to step up to the plate and pay you that fair value for it. And I think that's one of the things that we pride ourselves on is that we are financed for that, and we have paid millions of dollars for individual studios, and we're delighted to write that check because we love those schools that have a really big impact on our portfolio right away. And so I think that's one of the things that we hope differentiates us in the marketplace is that we care just as much as your individual buyer is going to, and we have a lot of experience running these studios. We hope we can be trusted with that important future, but we can also write that check.
Who takes on the HR piece?
We do. So the way that we've structured our business, and again, I've tried to give a lot of general advice about selling your stool to anybody, but in our case, we have what we call our shared services team, and the services that they provide to our studios are HR, recruitment, professional development for admin and teachers, marketing, which is probably our biggest advantage relative to a standalone school, the really national scale digital marketing resources, and then all of the accounting, payroll, finance, tax, compliance, HR stuff that people don't really, that no one.
Onboarding training?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So every buyer is going to want a business that's profitable and productive.
Yeah.
So how do you guarantee to staff that's left behind when an owner exits that you're not changing anything? Or does that come because you have vetted so well that you're not going to change something big in this business? You're
Right.
going to change maybe little things.
Yeah, or we'll be specific about what is changing, right? So Maybe we don't like the studio management software. Maybe there isn't one. We've bought some businesses that were running on pen and paper before, right? So we'll come in and we'll say, hey, great news, admin staff. We're not going to do this anymore. We're going to have these tools. But look, a lot of it comes from repetition. So we can take your staff members and connect them with people that have already been through that transition on our side, right? So we can take your studio director and connect them with the studio director that recently or several years ago went through this transition, and they can talk about what that experience was like and get them comfortable with it. But I think philosophically our commitment is that these studios have been successful in these areas because they were responsive to some need that the community had, right? And that's different in Seattle, in San Francisco, in Tampa, in Boston, in the center of the country, right? It's not the same. And so trying to offer a uniform brand or to force kind of homogenization is something that we think would be detrimental to the value that we've acquired. So that's an important part of our strategy. We try really hard to preserve that uniqueness, and that's a commitment we put front and center with everybody we talk to. I've probably had 1,000 onboarding conversations with staff, right? Like, hey, I'm Jeff, we just bought the studio, don't freak out, here's why, right? And a lot of that comes down to our commitment to really maintain sort of what is unique and then be able to describe, this is our plan for what we're changing and here's why it's good for you.
So, of the 45 acquisitions that you've done,
yes,
what percentage of the infrastructure remains the same inside the studios a year, 2 years later?
So if by infrastructure you mean people, it's almost everybody, right? So most studio owners, if they have a flaw, of course none of you do, but if they have a flaw, it's under investing, right? Almost never are there too many people to do what is needed to be done there, right? So it's usually under investment. And a lot of times that's because if you are there in your market, you can just go into the studio. If somebody's sick, somebody quits, no big deal. I'm going to go over and fill in, right? Because I was there and I've done that. From Denver, I don't have that luxury, right? And so we have to really invest in making sure that we have enough people. So we're never like buying the school and laying off a bunch of people or trying to force turnover. From a people infrastructure, it's usually 100% the same, other than voluntary turnover, because of course things change over months. In terms of the systems and administrative infrastructure, so basically everything finance is totally different, right? So we're going to come in with everything from merchant processing, banking, payroll, finance, accounting, that kind of stuff. It's all going to be different, but it's mostly going to be handled off-site, right? So your studio staff is not generally going to touch those items. We're going to have new HR software that the employees are going to have to interact with. It's kind of a drag, but it's probably better than what was in place, and so easy for them to, request sick time, request time off, update their address, change their tax information. Those sorts of things are easier done. And then subtly, we actually hope that there's some benefit from plugging folks into this community, right? So one of the benefits that we have is we have 45 location managers, and we have a couple hundred administrative staff, and we have 1,000 teachers, and sort of plugging them into a national community where they can interact with peers, share best practices, learn, teach, mentor, mentee. I think that's a sort of subtle benefit that we try to get from that over time. So I think, from a systems and process perspective, it's often pretty different, but that's in a way that's pretty invisible to your parents and your students. They're going to mostly walk in, they're going to see the same friendly face at the front desk, they're going to go into class with the same teacher. We are pretty soft from a pedagogy perspective. We're not, we don't have a rigid curricula that we're dropping in. We're mostly trying to acquire schools where that's already strong and sort of, not have a strong hand in that area. We don't want to change the programming. But from the administrative staff backward, there's a lot of change, but it's not too impactful in the community.
I don't think it's subtle. I think that's really interesting to think about, because one of the things that we struggle with at the size of business that we are is offering those kind of benefits to our employees.
Mm-hmm.
Some of us have brought staff here, but it's very expensive and the travel's expensive and all that, so it's interesting to think about how that might develop.
Yeah.
I'm curious if it offers those employees, are they now employees of Ensemble?
Mm-hmm.
And so then are there much more access to employee benefits that we wouldn't have access to because of the size of our companies?
That's probably the number one benefit that we tout is the benefits, right? So for your studio director or administrative staff, career progression is now something that's readily obvious, right? So there are general manager positions at other studios in the area. There are regional management positions. There's corporate positions that are available. So it's not the front desk or the back office isn't sort of the end of the journey. There's now path beyond that, which for a motivated, hardworking employee is generally really exciting. We offer full medical, dental, vision benefits. We offer 401k to every single employee, from 1 hour a week, one class a week teacher to full time. Everybody gets a 401k with company matching. We have subtler benefits like, work comp and those sorts of things. We strongly prefer to categorize our employees as employees and not as contractors, even in states where that's not straightforward. So that is, a positive that generally on the margin is really good for the employees, is they're almost always getting more than they had, even at the same rate of salary than they had before.
What if you don't want to sell your name?
It's a good question. We have worked with something like that. The best way to do that is to start something today, right? And not make the removal of, Jeff's Dance Academy, the day that the sale closes. If you're serious about wanting to sell your studio and wanting to not have your name go with it, it's helpful to, I don't know, maybe that, there we go. It's helpful to get that started, right? So whether it's, Jeff's Dance Academy at, Denver School of Performing Arts or whatever, like some way of kind of like starting that transition, that can be really helpful. But we can do it, we have done it. And it's just about sort of messaging and making people feel like, hey, this isn't going to be big and scary, and sort of taking baby steps towards that.
Can you talk a little bit about the owner that might sell and choose to stay on as an employee?
Yeah.
Do they now inherit sort of financial benchmarks, or now there are new goals in this new position?
Yeah, so that's a great question. We've had really beautiful partnerships with 4 owners that have sold us their school and stayed on to run it. I think generally their motivations fell into one of 2 buckets. First was the folks that were sort of kind of bird in the hand mindset, right? So I'm close to retiring, but I'm not ready today. So let me sell my studio. I can replace most of my income by becoming the manager. But importantly, and this is the second bucket, is I can reduce my scope of work, right? So I can just be the community leader, cheerleader, face of my studio, and I no longer have to run payroll. I no longer have to file taxes. I no longer have to do all the stuff that I didn't like doing anyway, that I did at 10 p.m. after the students left the studio, at night. And so that's generally the motivation they've had. We, even with our location managers, we take a soft approach to the idea that they're there because they love the environment, right? They don't want rigid financial objectives. They don't want, sort of pressure from a sales perspective. It's a performing arts school, right? And they show up to work at a performing arts school and they value that environment. And so we work really hard to message around, hey, we're trying to grow our community, trying to grow our enrollment. Here's how we're doing that. Our job at Ensemble is to generate leads, right? Make the phone ring. Your job is to talk about why this is the best place in your community to learn dance. And that's something that feels authentic and good. And so that's where we focus our efforts. Is we at Ensemble can generate leads, and we can make it happen from a marketing perspective. All you need to do is talk about why this is great, and that feels way better than your quota is 25 new students, or like we have to hit these metrics, or like we really don't run our business in that way. And that's because whether they were owners, whether they were employees, people that work in our schools, that's not their mindset. And we try to be respectful of that and communicate with them in a way that is authentic to them and makes it feel like this is an arts community and not a high pressure sales boiler room kind of environment.
Thank you.
Can you talk a little bit about the artistic side of things? Because of course we're all artists. And
Sure.
we have, like different artistic pieces in our
Yeah.
business. How does that play into what you do?
Yeah, so the beauty of it is we value those things, and that's the part that, if I can take you back to the sort of history of Ensemble and where I started the business, it was seeing a number of schools in the performing arts space that were just amazing at student experience, right? Curricular delivery, pedagogy, unbelievable, because that was the background of the owners, and they found like-minded people to come in and deliver that experience. Systems and processes, not so much, right? And that's my background. And I was sort of interested in coming and sort of tilting the scale up to be as good at school administration as we are at classroom experience. And so from the Ensemble perspective, we've never worried that the schools we acquired, that these are schools that have grown, that have had many year really positive reputations, that have really big enrollments. We never worried that the curricular experience wasn't good and that the artistic side wasn't appropriate for what that community was looking for. So we don't mess with it. Our job is to sort of be a curator or kind of caretaker for that artistic vision, while meanwhile like bringing a bunch of resources behind the scenes to actually communicate about why that's great to the community. So, I mean, I could teach music, I can't teach dance, but I don't. I mean, I'm not telling our teachers what to do from that perspective. We're looking to find studios where that's already in place in spades and where we can have a real impact on the behind the scenes stuff and making it as good as the curricular piece.
So curious, like on the ones that you have at the music schools, what's like the smallest town or demographics? Do you like go to the small towns, or are you interested mostly in the big cities?
Yeah.
I'm sure it has to do with the profit margin at the end.
Yeah. So it's a fair question, and it's one that's changed over time. So our smallest school today is in Rochester, Minnesota, 75 minutes outside of Minneapolis, town of about 100,000 people. And would we do that deal again, today? Maybe not, right? So today, our minimum at Ensemble that we'll look at is about $500,000 of revenue today. That's the minimum for us. Now, if you're smaller than that, there are lots of other great buyers in your community that can be the right fit for you. But we're looking mostly at $500,000 of gross revenue and up, and mostly also in kind of larger markets. Hopefully someday we own a school in La Crosse, Wisconsin. But otherwise, but otherwise it's good. But look, we're also thinking about metro areas, right? So like you don't have to be in Denver. We can buy the school in Boulder, but we want it to be part of something we can ultimately support with some regional scale because that's beneficial. Anybody else? Sorry, you're just scratching your head. Sorry. All right. Well, thank you for coming. It's been a pleasure to talk to you. If you'd like to talk to me in private, there's my QR code. Otherwise, have a great rest of your conference, and I'll be around.